Okay, so welcome again, everyone, to our second panel of the day called Gaming the Middle Ages. I'm Juan Manuel Rui. I'm going to be the chair of this panel. And now after having seen the relationship between the Middle Ages and games from the developer's perspective, now we're going to focus more from the gameplay and from the player's experience about the Middle Ages. For this, we have three very interesting panels by Olga Kalashnikova, Raquel Miranda, and Rob Houghton. So let's get directly into it. We're going to begin with Olga. Olga Kalashnikova is a doctoral candidate at the Department of Medieval Studies at the Central European University. She has been working on her PhD project, Preaching the Passion in 14th Century Bohemia, the Rhetoric of Good Friday Sermons, under the supervision of Gabor Planitsai and Pietro del Como. Olga's primary research interests are late medieval religious history, intellectual history, and sermon studies. Moreover, she's a passionate gamer and is particularly interested in medievalism's procedural rhetoric, political propaganda, and historical accuracy in video games. She's also a member of the Central and Eastern European Historical Gaming Collective. So Olga, you will have 20 minutes to present your paper. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Juan, for this very nice introduction, and thank you for presenting me. So if everyone can see my PPT, I guess I can start and get into it. So as I have recently discussed with my colleague, many historians interested in video games often have to start their conference presentations or academic papers with a financial comparison between the film and video game industries to justify the importance of studying the latter sector. Admittedly, both films and video games partly share a similar nature because they are incredibly successful globally as they keep beating new selling records. So following Chapman, one may state that the essence of this success lies in their immersive nature, allowing the audience, that is, those who watch or those who play, to go through the plot of a movie or a video game and experience certain emotions and sensations related to it. The rule here is simple. So the more emotions a media product evokes, the more it is discussed and hence becomes more popular and profitable. Despite this common impetus to attract people to the final product, the mechanism that video games use to evoke emotions and create an immersive environment is fundamentally different from that of the film industry because of the player agency. Players are in the center of the gaming industry, well, obviously, as they control gaming avatars, enjoy games plots and immersive environments, and after all, they pay money for new releases. For this reason, many researchers have attempted to contribute to the general understanding of generating emotions in video games through the player response concept. However, they proposed solutions either ignored the particularities of the medieval setting as a normative tool or offered limited insight into its role, mainly focusing on sensational stimuli such as quasi-medieval music or, for example, visual content. During the next 15 minutes, I'll try to partly fill in this scholarly gap with an interdisciplinary case study of a medieval-oriented game and its potential to generate an emotional experience. Adopting Don Norman's concept of three-dimensional emotional design, I will showcase how Penance can be modeled and experienced in a popular Metroidvania called Blasphemous. Before diving into the methodological and analytical discussions, I should make a quick remark on terminology. And throughout this presentation, I will extensively use the word emotions, so I think it's worth defining it as there are many interpretations of the term. For example, according to 10, emotion is defined as, and here I quote, a change in action readiness due to the subject's appraisal of the situation or event, so quotation closed. I simplify this understanding and consider emotions as psychological states that are changed by certain stimuli, which are mainly dependent on a person's inner state of mind and external context. Unfolding this definition makes us realize that emotions are largely reliant on how a person perceives something. Quite often, developers benefit from this realization because they artificially manufacture an emotional experience to achieve the intended emotional response, employing the so-called emotional design. Cognitive scholar Donald Norman coined the term emotional design at the beginning of this millennium. Norman proposes a threefold interpretation of humans' emotional system, as you can see on this slide, which also partly adheres to some basic marketing principles. These three levels are visceral, behavioral, and reflective. So let's quickly look at them. The visceral level is responsible for reflective or animalistic facets of human emotions, as it focuses on the perceptible qualities or appearances of an object and how they make the user feel. For example, according to some researchers, aesthetically pleasing products would attract users more and thus form a stronger emotional connection among the audience. The behavioral level can be defined as usability, as it deals with a certain product's practical and functional aspects. Thus, the behavior design focuses on how quickly users can achieve their objectives and how many challenges they can encounter while interacting with the product. Therefore, this level of emotional design essentially orchestrates the emotions that users feel when they accomplish their goals or fail in doing so. Another example may briefly illustrate this strategy. So, for instance, when someone can interact with an object and fulfill their goals with a minimum of effort, such interaction will generate positive emotions and increase the usability and popularity of this product. In contrast, when an object forces users to adjust to its limitations, people will most likely experience frustration and refuse using this project at all. The last reflective level considers how a product can affect the audience's self-conscious, their ability to acquire new concepts and make generalizations about the world. Norman regards it as the highest level of emotional design, and by reflecting on a product's pros and cons and what it personally means to each individual, users can start talking about their experience with a specific item or a game or a film and advance its expansion on the market. As you can see on the next slide, a team of media and cognitive scholars has recently modified this methodological framework to study video games. However, I suggest adapting this approach to video game studies even more, and while I accept the framework proposed for the affective or visceral domain, I offer to equalize the behavior level of emotional design not to the vision or auditory experience, but to game mechanics and rules, as they directly affect the user's completion of goals and experiencing certain failures. I will refer to this domain as a functional emotional design, and lastly, I will connect the reflective level to a game's lore and narrative, and I will broadly label it as a conceptual level. Interestingly, as you can see here on the slide, both the group of new media scholars and Norman almost exclusively consider an object's emotive potential as effective only if it generates a delightful experience instead of evoking dull and dreary emotions. Consequently, they stress the importance of creating predominantly fun and pleasurable products by mixing all three design levels. Indeed, as I will demonstrate in the case of the Blasphemous video game, each level of such a design effectively contributes to creating selected emotions. However, as we will now see, the game brings not a delight, but rather an opposite spectrum of emotions. Blasphemous is a video game developed by a Spanish independent studio called The Game Kitchen. So it was published in 2019 on multiple platforms. Stylized in a two-dimensional side-scrolling form, the game belongs to the Metroidvania genre, focused on non-linear and an unguided exploration and progression. Assuming the role of a penitent silent knight, players find themselves in the functional region of Custodia, consumed by heresy, apocalyptic aspirations, and moral decay among the clergy members and common people. Cleansing their sins and restoring a religious order in this virtual medieval state becomes the player's primary objective. One may achieve the final goal through a multiple series of, well, quite hardcore battles, and a special sword named Mea Culpa should help the penitent ones stir the enemies to repent. I argue that the game's focus on medieval spirituality and the concept of penance is a particularly effective emotive tool, as it steadily replicates a powerful emotional chain of fear, guilt, and gratitude or relief on all the three levels of the game's emotional design. So let us now examine how Blasphemous can construct this emotional chain on visceral, functional, and conceptual levels. First of all, extreme, gloomy, and over-bloody violence permeates the game and its visual appearance, as you can see. Biologists and psychologists repeatedly point out that darkness is one of the most effective visceral emotional generators because it often provokes an uncontrollable feeling of fear and anxiety in human beings. The game diligently follows and intensifies this biological concept on its visceral level by adopting a stereotypical medieval-like look. Locations in Blasphemous are dark, they lack light, and have almost no bright elements. Moreover, numerous visual tropes of horror, death, and aggression intensify this primal anguish and even bring it to a grotesque level, turning fear and anxiety into strong reactions of disgust. So-called religious and body horror, so these are the names of the video game tropes, is most vividly illustrated through mysterious and terrifying environments and creepy foes. Dead bodies are littered at each location, and this notion is evident even in the starting area, where the penitent one awakens. So this is the second image. Hideous mutations and mutilations caused by a divine force called the grievous miracle are common among the inhabitants of Custodia. Deformity, parasites, contamination, the ravages of disease, and the aftermaths of bodily injury should raise primal fear in the player as they progress through the game. Next, the nudity of foes and the majority of bosses emphasizes not their natural beauty, as you can see, but rather a barbaric brutality and aggression directed at the penitent one. Additionally, the brutal executions that the player can commit upon them often involve dismemberment, evisceration, and bloody crushing. Therefore, the game's setting and characters are practically soaked in blood and rotten viscera. Hence, deformity, death, and blood are the guiding visual elements of Blasphemous. Their combination effectively evokes primal animalistic feelings among the players, thus building up the first emotional component of the fear, guilt, gratitude penitential chain. The game's mechanics intensify the same emotional chain and bring it to the next functional level. Creating the first element of the penitential emotional chain, Blasphemous replicates fearful situations of an inevitable ambush, when the game locks up the player in rooms with powerful and scary enemies without a possibility to escape. Furthermore, the game attempts to create as frustrating gaming experience as possible. It's extremely hard to navigate in its virtual world and fight enemies. To illustrate this fact, let me mention just one example. So Blasphemous has absolutely no regulators of the difficulty level. So personally, playing it was often highly excruciating for me. Hence, I turned it off several times after an unsuccessful battle and blamed myself even for downloading it. The mercilessness of the game mechanics goes even further because Blasphemous does not encourage dying and continuing the game from the last checkpoint, as some other games would normally do. If the main character dies, he accumulates the so-called guilt points, which impede him from gaining religious fervor and amplifying his combat abilities. Only a visit to confessor stages, which are actually quite rare in the game, can purge the guild points and restore the combat abilities to the normal level. Although the game received much criticism for its difficulty, some players actually admitted on gaming forums that they eventually experienced a feeling of catharsis after beating a boss or finishing the main storyline. As a result, the pain, frustration, and subsequent relief evoked by numerous fighting ordeals fit medieval theological imagery that saw moral and physical suffering as the main element of penance. I would even compare this excruciating gameplay to Spanish medieval Good Friday processions of flagellants, a picture of which I also put on the slide. I must mention, however, that similar visceral and functional emotive strategies are implied in the Dark Souls medieval video game series and its derivatives. As the developers of Blasphemous admitted, they used the Dark Souls and its gloomy and frustrating gameplay as a source of inspiration. However, as we will now see in the last part of my presentation, in Blasphemous, the Middle Ages act not only as a visceral emotive framework, but also take a central role in generating emotions on a conceptual level. Typically, for many medieval games, the religion of Custodia is heavily based on Catholic Christianity. More notable for us is that Blasphemous uses religious preoccupation with Christ's passion as the skeleton for its narrative and lore. For instance, as I have already mentioned, the names of the sword, main hero, game points, and other key elements mirror the game's focus on this subject. To illustrate it briefly, I will recap that the hero is the so-called penitent one, fighting with the mea culpa sword, and collecting 3 holy wounds is essential to progress in the first half of the game. Moreover, one may encounter recurring motifs of sacred blood and holy wounds throughout the game. Let me quickly mention a few examples of this passion mystical imagery. For example, the opening cutscene to the left begins with a grievous woman stabbing herself with a sword, producing a copious amount of blood and eventually turning her into a sacred statue. Similarly, the Virgin was pierced by the sword of sorrow when she saw Christ dying on the cross. One can find another example of the game's fixation with blood and non-healed sacred wounds among non-playable characters. For instance, as the game reveals, once upon a time, a beautiful village girl called Audrey burned her face with hot oil, wishing to demonstrate her humility and self-sacrifice for the grievous miracle. Upon taking up the vows at a local convent, she realized that the wounds she inflicted on herself would never heal, remaining fresh, smoking, and agonizingly painful. So naturally, just as a medieval female mystic, she became a saint for the people of Custodia and was canonized in life as Our Lady of the Charred Visage, as you can see here on the slide. Turning back to my argument about the game's preoccupation with Christ's passion, I claim that the very plot of Blasphemous is in a way imitatio Christi. Suffering Christ is a recurring figure in the game because one may encounter several Christ-like characters in different locations of Custodia, as you can see on the visuals. So for example, there to the right, you can see like the Pietà statue. More importantly, the penitent one, and thus the player who assumes his role, replicates Christ's sacrificial journey on a physical and conceptual level. Namely, as the game's comic book explains, by the beginning of the plot, the main hero had already died one time and risen from the dead to finish Custodia's cycle of penance. This allusion to Jesus gradually becomes more visible as the penitent one proceeds to the cathedral rooftops, which is the final area of the game located at the very top of the world map. In such a way, the main hero physically echoes Jesus, bringing the cross to the Calvary. Furthermore, the culmination of the main story represents a direct allusion to Christ's oblation. Despite everything one does, the canon ending scene of the game will remain the same, and the cycle of suffering in Custodia will continue. Upon defeating the final boss, the penitent one will climb the hill of ash to reach a so-called relic throne. On the top of the hill, he realizes that he should stab himself with mea culpa and pour his blood on the throne in order to cleanse the corrupted lands and inhabitants of Custodia. The sword penetrates his body, and one of its thorns wraps around the dead penitent one, gradually turning him into a tree. As the epilogue reveals, the people later considered the penitent one as a messiah-like figure, calling him the last son of the miracle. To conclude, as I have just demonstrated, Blasphemous uses a complex mixture of emotive practices that go hand in hand with Norman's theory of emotional design. Yet, instead of creating a delightful experience, the game does the opposite job and focuses on evoking feelings of fear, anguish, and subsequent relief upon beating it. The tactic to use the Middle Ages as a decorative tool for an extremely difficult game is not innovative, however, as the Dark Souls game series inspired it. However, what makes the use of the Middle Ages in Blasphemous exceptional is its focus on medieval salvific and mystical religiosity. While the game replicates a painful but voluntarily penitential journey on the functional level, so its mechanics and the very way how a player plays and beats the difficulty of the game, its conceptual connections to medieval passion spirituality intensify the creation of the fear, guilt, gratitude emotive chain. Such an approach makes the playing experience particularly exceptional and memorable. After all, the game certainly evoked a bright spectrum of emotions among the players because it was considered one of the most popular indie games of the last few years. So just to conclude, let us bear in mind that upon release, it reached over 1 million players on all platforms within 2 years, which is quite a good result for an indie game. So I thank you for your attention, and I also put here a very brief list of selected literature for those who are interested, and I will be happy to hear and answer to your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olga, for your paper. That was very, very interesting. I didn't know about that game, so I'll have to look it out because it does look like a lot of fun. Okay, so following with our program, our next speaker is Raquel Miranda. Raquel is presenting also with Gerardo Rodríguez. Both of them are researchers at the National Council for Scientific and Technical Research in Argentina. Raquel Miranda is also a professor at National University of La Pampa, and Gerardo Rodríguez is professor at National University of Mar del Plata, both in the same country. Raquel is a PhD Magister in Social and Cultural Studies, Magister in History of Spanish Literature, and she is a postdoctoral in Social Studies. Her field of study is medieval literature with emphasis on rhetoric and semiotic approaches to a literary phenomena, especially the representation and functionality of human bodies. Gerardo is a PhD and Magister Magister Artis in History, and he's a member of the National Academy of History. His field of study is medieval history, focused on sensory, social, and cultural history, and gamification applied to the study of the Middle Ages. Their production in the form of books, chapters, and articles is very abundant, especially in Spanish. So Raquel, please feel free to share your screen, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Juan. Good morning, everyone. After having been introduced, I must tell you that my partner in the authorship of the paper, Gerardo, cannot connect to the conference today. So I will speak on behalf of both of us. As you can see in the slide, we live and work in Argentina, Gerardo in the city of Mar del Plata, and me in Santa Rosa, in the middle of the Pampas. The aim of our paper is to underline the sensitive reasons, sensory and emotional, for the success of the video games, which range from issues of an artistic nature related to the quality of the production to reasons linked to gameplay and immersion, since the experience of capturing the game's attentions involves all the senses and promotes the most varied emotions. This intersensory and immersive experience, as she explains in part, the success of video games, since gamers feel and are moved beyond the physical sense involved. The analysis of this sensitive experience will be carried out based on the following video games. La Abadía del Crimen from 1987 and A Plague Tale Innocence 2019. Video games as cultural element of leisure is undoubtedly fully established not only in our society, but globally. The possibilities of cultural transmissions are factors worth taking into account when addressing the establishment of concepts, ideas, and icons by new generations, already identified as digital natives or similar expressions, who consider video games a thing exclusively of their own. Unlike other formidable media of training like literature and cinema, the world of video games profits from the interactions and exploration of the environment. In almost any of the arts, we are mere passive spectators. We have no choice but follow a given story. Someone decides each action for us, and we have no choice but to enjoy it as much as possible. Whereas video games make us an active receptor because it is us who decides who to do, how to do, and when to do it. Video games must be considered as an artistic expression, as the Museum of Modern Art in New York City has confirmed by including some titles, Pong, Space Invaders, and Minecraft, and even a home console among its exhibitions. Video games not only features stunning art and soundtracks, they also tell stories in a way that no other medium could. This is why every artistic expression seeks to amaze each and every one of our senses, surprise us with incredible stories, with all possible endings, with happy endings, with impressive designs, with quality infographic and soundtracks that completely surround. Video games offer us practically infinite freedom and possibilities of choice in which our whole body participates in a sensory experience. The most interesting thing about this medium is situated on the sociological, anthropological, and psychological level, since it is the playability, the immersiveness, and the multisensory nature that makes them unique, especially since the technology explosion in the 90s, which helped to develop more versatile and powerful products. Nowadays, investment in video games art is almost as much important as the development of the game itself. This premium quality makes the playing experience an intersensory experience in which all the senses participate, even those that do not have a real presence in the game, such as taste and smells. We consider so the video game as a cultural construct, as a work of art, and as an object that characterizes and defines the homo ludens of our contemporaneity. We want to highlight the sensory reasons for the success of video games, which range from reasons of an artistic nature related to the quality of its making or productions to reasons related to the gameplay and immersiveness, where the experience of capturing the game's attention is a multisensory experience in which all the senses participate intersensory. This intersensory experience refers to the holistic condition of the five senses, that is, to the interrelation of all of them at the moment of the subject perception, which often generates what is known as synesthetic phenomenon. Etymologically, the word synesthesia derives from the Greek syn, union, and aesthesis, sensation, literally the joining of the senses. Synesthesia is an involuntary joining in which the real information of one sense is accompanied by a perception in another one. Besides, this additional perception is considered by the synesthete as real, frequently outside the body, instead of imagined in the mind's eye. Hence, synesthesia can be defined in several ways. The secondary or associated sensation that occurs in one part of the body as a result of a stimulus applied to another part of it. The subjective image or sensation typical of a sense determined by another sensation that affects a different sense. And regarding the rhetorical device, the joining of two images or sensations coming from different sensory domains, such as silent sound, like in Dante's Inferno, tasting the rainbow, watching the music, among many other examples. All of these meanings of synesthesia may be recognized in the game experience. In fact, the achieved experience, the immersed experience achieved explains in part the success of video games, since players feel and are moved beyond the physical sense involved. Just by playing, they can perceive the stench of death, the sordidness of the plague, the incessant bustle of wars, the silence of scriptoria beyond the soundtracks, the tactile materiality of the constructions, roughness, porosity, or get emotionally involved with the situation experience, which range from the acceptance to the absolute rejections, manifested in the both verbal and bodily expressions. The video games burst into the universe of cultural expression in the most diverse ways. One of them is manifested through the transmission of historical content, through script based on events, iconography, sequence, and topics from past periods, as in the case of novels, movies, and television series framed in past times. We can clearly identify them by the embodiment of repeated models, a medieval castle, a Roman forum, or a Baroque palace. When the video games development team, scriptwriter, computer engineer, or graphic artist agreed to make a product with this characteristic, they do so with the sense aspirations of other creators and technical professionals. But as in cinema, literature, and television, there are many types of video games. What is more, the complexity lies in the very idiosyncrasies of the channel. The interaction and intervention of the user as participants in the final products means that there are not only differences in the contents or approach of the video game narrative, but also in the way of playing them according to the genre of the title. A graphic adventure is not played in the same way as an arcade, strategy, simulation, platform, or puzzle. But what does make them equal is the audiovisual background and context in the strict and most literary sense of the term. So it must be noted that the historical video game, understood as one that meets the four basic characteristics that define it: veracity, plausibility, information, and freedom to play it, is what makes us consider them from a historian's point of view. The analysis we carry out in this paper takes into consideration exclusively two historical games with events set in the Middle Ages, La Abadía del Crimen and A Plague Tale: Innocence, in different territories at different times with different characters and with an uneven technological development. But what is interesting to remark is that they come together in what we recognize as the late Middle Ages in general and the 14th century in particular, and transmit and exemplify our imaginary of medieval times, in which issues related to religions, wars, famines, and death have a predominant role. The reasons why the medieval period is so fascinating and attractive for our civilization are multiple. It is a process that for the West goes back to the Romantic movement, forming part of its essence, and that currently manifests itself in the emergence of historical novels and of literary phenomena of enormous publishing success that flavor their plot with historical elements, legendary or not. G.R.R. Martin resorts to various historical games in Games of Thrones, although if necessary. Tolkien should be mentioned as the inspiration for this work and ended up configuring their own culture. The medieval historical novel has undoubtedly been one of the most successful subgenres, with 3 titles that could be among of the top 10 of any list: Le Roi Maudit by Maurice Duron, Il Nome della Rosa by Umberto Eco, and The Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. La Abadía del Crimen is a single-player adventure video game designed by Paco Menéndez and Juan del Can, based on the novel by Eco. Despite its lack of commercial success, the game became a cult classic.
I'm
Yes.
sorry, Raquel. I don't know if you're changing the slides because it's still the Assassin's Creed one. Okay, there you go.
Thank you, Juan. Despite its lack of commercial success, the game became a cult classic of the 8-bit era, and thanks to the emergence of the retro phenomenon, the game became such a classic that was republished, improved in La Abadía del Crimen Extensum 12. In this case, with clear additions to the film and television adaptations of the original work by the Italian author. In this video game adventure, the Franciscan Friar William of Baskerville and the young novice Azzo have to discover the author of a series of murders that take place in an abbey located in the Italian peninsula during the 14th century. Throughout 7 days, it is necessary to carry out the work of a monk at that time, while in his spare time, he must carry out the investigation of the abbey. William must accompany with the abbot's orders and at all times, particularly attending mass and the dining room when the bell rings, and not having his cell at night, an order he does not obey. At the beginning of the game, an initial scroll is shown, accompanied by a melody giving an account of the reason of the presence in the abbey, which is the same as the quest in the game. The actions must take place inside the abbey, and each day in the game is divided into several parts according to the canonical hours, summarizing the real organization of the cloister monk. Matins, Lot, Prime, Terce, Six, Nun, Vespers, and Complaint. With La Abadía del Crimen Extensum, the game profits from later adaptation of the novel made into a film and a television series. It is the gross media phenomenon in the most literal sense, the generation of the basic argument that will be reflected in various media and with different cultural expressions: cinema, novel, comic, video game, painting, sculpture, all framed in the user's desires of possessing part of that product. It is the key of marketing. Sorry. In the case at hand, the background is certainly complicated, since it is an adaptation of the video game environment that already has an adaptation in an audiovisual medium. An actor already lends his face to a character, and it is very possible that the viewer expects to see in the video game someone who resembles what he or she already knows, as if it were the rest of the scene and here's topic in the case medieval ones. A Plague Tale, in no sense, is an action-adventure and logic video game that follows the story of two brothers, Amicia and Hugo, who fight together to survive the brutality of a world unknown to them and devastated by the war, the Inquisition, and the plague. These young characters are accompanied by desolation, fear, and death that take over the game from the first image and sounds associated with the experience of the silence of solitude, the stench of dirt or rotten food surrounded by flies, disease and death, the flapping of wings of crowds, of the noise of insects, or the footsteps on the little protagonist. Scraping from room, Amicia and Hugo will allow us to feel with their bodies and their experience the critical situation of the mid-14th century in France, where fear of the plague, war, and the Inquisition appears in one way or another in the dialogues and in the different levels of the games, which show images that refer to the abandonment of common spaces, the city, the countryside, the fair, the house, and the breaking of social ties. Concern Amicia wonders, where is everyone? Vividly, the video game showed us the worst of all fears, the fear of finding oneself in the city besieged by the disease, as described by Jean Delemont in La Peur en Occident. Family agitation and conversations, the daily sounds from fair and craft, door-to-door neighborhood gatherings, children's songs and games, and many other things have completely vanished from urban reality. The landscape presented by the video games, with its closed doors marked in white to detect the infected and windows blocked with nails and wood, is constant and repetitive. The anguish and terror are transmitted directly to the pair of brothers. For fear of mutual contagion, Delemont argues, the inhabitants of the cities separate themselves from each other, avoiding opening the windows of their own houses and surviving with the few food reserves that they have been able to accumulate previously. To characterize this period of plague, the author used the term forced solitude, very suggestive and applicable to the video game. When Amikia needs help, she said in front of a closed door, "Excuse me, I am the daughter of Mr. Robert de Dune. No title, privilege, or status seems to have validity against the plague. The abandonment is certain and the beginning of a tense string medley with some crowds in the background seems to agree." In an adventure video game with established game mechanisms, shooting with a slingshot, hiding in the bush, an abstract or invisible villain cannot be fought or avoided. The plague is presented in an ingenious way, materialized in colonies of thousands and thousands of rats, a real plague. The plague is rats. If the rats bite you, you are dead. And although it contradicts the theories that consider the plague as an infection and contagious disease transmitted to man through the real rat flea, are not the rat bite itself, the fact of crystallizing the plague in the body of many rats gives it entity and presents it like something visible, tangible, something material, and a possible character to fight within the mechanics the games offer us. The circumstance imposed by the 14th century on medieval contemporaries accentuated this feeling and made death an everyday occurrence. Pessimism in the face of life runs parallel to fear and the constant presence of death. The collective attitude towards death becomes more obsessive and begins to occupy a very important place in art and literature. An example of this could be the macabre dances or dance of death, artistic literature expression representing a series of scenes in which personified death, just like the plague is personified by the rats in this video game, is paired with the living human beings, dragging them to dance with her. Death is a constant siege. We walk among the corpses piled up in the streets of the cities and among the deaths resulting from a battle of Valois against Plantagenet, framed in the 100 Years' War. In the conversations the warriors have with each other, the recurrence of war and concern for death is remarkable. Well, to arrive to an end. The rise of video games and technology will mark the path of education over the next decade, given that we are not in a time of change, but in a change of an era. This change of era implies new forms of teaching, research, and extension based on the impact of digital entertainment media on the cultural formation of today's society. The use of pedagogy centered on game-based learning, The development of series of games, gamification, and simulation will complete the socialization process initiated in childhood and will enhance the incorporation of knowledge in general and historical ones in particular, like the case we have discussed related to very varied aspects of the 14th century in Western Europe. A good story has enormous potential value. There is no doubt that a good history is the result of methodological and scientific work and is necessary for the analysis and understanding of past civilizations. When fusions between them occurs within the framework of a cultural product, whether it is carried out as a means of expression or as a means of disseminations, the possibilities are limitless. Only when it is played, the video game is configured as a complete medium, since it depends on the decision of the person who plays it for its final results. In fact, it is the interactive and immersive nature of the elements that defines it. We have come to hear in some of our public interventions that the video games limits the imagination with respect to the novel, because one sees and hears what has to be mentally constructed in the text through the guidelines specified by the author description. But there are critics made about the video game and not about the cinema, for instance, and that ignore the specificity of the genres and the supports of fictions. So any comparison is capricious and useless. As a clear matter, we must also point out that they are comments made by those who do not have a clear understanding of what a video game is, since this creative task of the scenarios and narratives works in the same ways as in other cultural products, but with the unprecedented factor of the necessary intervention of the gamer. If memory has been altered according to the medium used to consolidate it, the possibilities allowed by the video game are extremely wide and ambitious, since the stories can no longer be seen or heard, but they can be recreated and lived to learn and enjoy it in accordance with the designs of our time. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your intervention, Raquel. Finally, our last paper is by Robert Houghton. Robert is a lecturer in early medieval history at the University of Winchester. His research focuses on Italian political and social networks and on medievalist computer games. Recent publications include Playing the Crusades and the Middle Ages in Modern Culture. Rob has worked with the Public Medievalist and with Paradox Interactive, and is currently the lead organizer for the Middle Ages in Modern Games Twitter conference. So Rob, feel free to share your screen, and the floor is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Juan, and thank you for having me, and thanks to all the speakers so far today. There's been some really fascinating bits and pieces about games in the Middle Ages in a many and varied environment. I need to start off unusually with a content warning. I'm going to be talking very briefly about mental health, eating disorders, and substance abuse as game mechanics. I'm also going to be talking about medievalist strategy games. These games, I'm sure everyone's very well familiar with. The Civilization series is perhaps the key example of a strategy game, and strategy games have been recognized increasingly as being very good for certain types of history. They're very good at detailing cause and effect. They can provide a huge amount of detail about the worlds they describe, and they're also very effective models for historical arguments. If we go to Chapman's model of realist and conceptual simulations, which has been cited, I believe, 3 or 4 times already in this conference, so I'm going to keep this relatively brief. Strategy games sit at one extreme of Chapman's dichotomy. They're very much presented as the paragon of conceptual simulations, games which do their history through their mechanics, as opposed to realist simulations, these games which present their history through their graphics or their narratives. And Chapman describes this spectrum running from the realist end, from action games such as Chivalry, Chivalry 2, through adventure games like the Assassin's Creed series, through role-playing games like Kingdom Come Deliverance, through real-time strategy games like the Age of Empires series, and finally onto turn-based, deeper strategy games, representing this array of games, this array of different ways of addressing history, running very broadly from representing history through the world through to representing history through mechanics. There are various limitations to this model, and indeed Chapman, right from the start, recognized that this was only ever meant to be a guide. It was never meant to be a prescriptive final description of and categorization of historical games, but it's a very widespread model and it's a very useful one. There are, however, several key drawbacks to strategy games, to these conceptual simulations and their representations of history. A few of the key areas here are that these games, they tend towards a representation of colonialism and imperialism as the driving forces of history. Like Asa said right back at the very first paper today, there's a tendency for players of these games to paint the map, to seek to conquer the world. At the same time, the very abstract mechanics of many of these games tend to turn them into puzzles rather than into games. The game becomes about describing or discovering the optimal strategy within the mechanics to conquer the world most often, rather than engaging with the actual historical themes which these mechanics represent. And these games also tend towards a representation of the control of polities, of countries, of nations, of other states over a vast sweep of time. And as a consequence, they tend towards the production of ridiculously long-term planning, where players will work towards an ultimate game goal over centuries, if not millennia. For medieval history in particular, a key issue is distinguishing the period from other periods of history. Medieval kings tend to play just like modern autocrats or ancient emperors. Everybody wants to conquer the world within these games, and while there are certainly a few medieval kings who took that approach, these were relatively few and far between. At the same time, these games tend to impose modern systems of economics, warfare, and so forth. They tend to imbue the player with a ridiculous degree of knowledge over the world around them and a ridiculous degree of power over and control over their various kingdoms and so forth. And in doing so, they once again impose a system of long-term planning which would just be ridiculous within the Middle Ages. Many of these drawbacks can and indeed have been overcome. Few examples up on the screen there, from Mount and Blade, through Reigns, through as far as the eye. These games present different approaches. They make use of the strategy genre to provide mechanics which move starkly against imperialism. They limit the power of rulers, and they change the focus of mechanics and play to something beyond constant warfare, constant conquest, and so forth. But today, though, I want to talk about roleplay. I want to talk about the potential of roleplay in creating deeper historical experiences, in particular within strategy games. I want to talk about the ways in which game developers and, well, I suppose historical lecturers can get their players into the mindset of medieval figures. I'm going to talk about three things in my presentation today. First of all, I want to talk about the use of roleplay and within and around strategy games. I'm going to provide a brief potted history of how this element has been imported into the strategy genre. I'm then going to talk about Crusader Kings 3 as a bit of an extended example of several particular mechanics, several particular ideas which have been developed to try and encourage players to role play as medieval kings rather than just try and conquer the world as they would in any other strategy game. And finally, I want to talk a bit about how we can take these ideas a bit further, about how some of these ideas tie in with a lot of the material that's already been talked about in this conference. I'm thinking in particular of Asa and James in the previous session. To get started then, I want to talk about role play within strategy games. So role-playing in medievalist games, role-playing in historical games in general, has a bit of a tenuous history. There are a huge number of role-playing games, and for various reasons, I think role-playing is one of the most effective ways in which we can get players to engage with history. However, these games tend to focus on the fantasy, on the science fiction. When they do engage with history, it's almost always through a lens of magic flying everywhere or aliens hiding under the four-poster bedsheets. These sorts of games like Kingdom Come Deliverance, they can be hugely influential on the ways in which their players engage with history. In fact, there's some evidence they can be even more influential than any other form of game. However, role-playing games tend to be very linear. They tend to display arbitrary morality. They tend to encourage power gaming, creating the most powerful character with the best possible outcomes, rather than trying to play as a particular character to play to a particular ideal. Roleplay is often an auxiliary element within these games. It tends to be more about playing your way through the story, creating an ever more powerful character. And indeed, the use of roleplay places the onus very much on the player. The player has to decide how they're going to engage with their character, if indeed they're going to engage with that character at all. And we have seen roleplay or roleplay elements present within strategy games almost since their origin point. So if we go to games like Master of Magic, we see a very hero-based form of strategy games, where the ruler, where key characters have different statistics, different abilities, have different utility skills, which can lead to these characters and these factions playing in a fundamentally different manner. Likewise, we see these totemic leaders within games like the Civilization series, who from Civilization 3 onwards have had a number of different characteristics, a number of different advantages and different disadvantages, which get carried over the entire course of the game. Both of these approaches offer some substantial potential for role-playing, but this is entirely optional and it's entirely player-led. There remains a tendency to ignore these role-playing elements and simply focus on winning the game. Within games like some of the Total War series, we see a slightly different and perhaps deeper approach. Here we have Medieval Total War, Medieval Total War 2 rather, employs a system of traits and leveling up as storytelling. The characters you have access to throughout the game will gain experience or become more powerful. They'll gain particular traits which give them benefits or drawbacks to being put in particular positions. However, within these games, the system is still very much secondary and rather flat. The game, as the title might suggest, is still very much focused on war and conquest. We do see a number of games, such as Crusader Kings 2, which go a bit further, which create these more complex characters. Crusader Kings 2 is very much a character-focused game. You play as a dynasty, not as a nation. Everybody gets traits. Every single character, often numbered in the hundreds of thousands, have a series of often very complex traits which can influence or determine the behavior of the computer actors. It can influence the character development and the interaction between this vast array of characters. It creates a broader range of play options, and it has the potential to create a really deep and broad game, particularly as Crusader Kings has no real objectives. The game provides a huge scope to focus on being a medieval king. However, despite all this optionality, all this potential for role-playing, the vast majority of players still play Crusader Kings in more or less exactly the same manner as they play Civilization, as they play Total War. Warfare remains the core mechanic, and players almost ubiquitously try to conquer the world, or at least a large portion of it. This is possibly driven by the use of maps. That a player is presented with a map, as Asa said this morning, and immediately tries to paint it. It's what players expect from this genre. Even when players engage with these role-playing elements, it's still a focus on power gaming. It's just done with more complex mechanics. Rather than trying to build the most powerful empire imaginable, players try to build the most powerful characters and the most powerful families imaginable. They try to make the strongest characters just as they would within a role-playing game, just as they would within Kingdom Come Deliverance, for example. And there's still a focus on massively long-term planning, these attempts to conquer the world, or in this case, a large part of it. We've seen an effort within Crusader Kings 3 to encourage role-play in a broader dimension, and we've seen some evidence that this has been successful to a certain extent. So Crusader Kings 3 is, well, it's a game of the same breadth and depth as Crusader Kings 2, so you can play it as one of a vast number of characters running from emperors down to lowly counts across Europe, across large parts of Africa, across the Middle East, across India, right the way up to the borders of China. In some respects, Crusader Kings 3 streamlines Crusader Kings 2, it streamlines the game, it removes several of the core issues of Crusader Kings 2, perhaps most notably the decadence mechanics around Muslim characters within Crusader Kings 2. In many ways, Crusader Kings 3 is less Eurocentric. There's still a core model of how societies will behave, but it's less focused on the feudal system. It's more modular. It's more adaptable to play as Muslim characters, as Hindu characters, as characters from across the world. And perhaps most importantly, from a commercial standpoint, Crusader Kings 3 is also a much prettier game. Rather than having these character portraits, we see full representations of the characters in glorious 3 dimensions, with increasing numbers of animations around them. This makes for a much prettier game, but it also makes for a game which is much harder for me to run on my aging laptop. Nevertheless, the important part for me today, though, is that Crusader Kings 3 provides a deeper characterization of the vast numbers of figures it represents. We see greater impact of character traits on gameplay events. In particular, we see a greater divergence in lifestyle abilities. Crusader Kings 3 provides 5 different lifestyles, 5 different core lifestyles for various different characters to fit into. And this includes the martial lifestyle, perhaps most akin to that common within other strategy games, but you can also play as a proficient diplomat, as a hugely competent steward and ruler. You can play as a king focused on learning and religion, or you can play as a king focused on the full-blown Machiavellian intrigues of the wildest dreams of, well, of any medieval ruler. There's a lot more interesting gameplay to experience beyond warfare, and there's a stronger steer for players to play the role of their characters. If you've got a character who's particularly proficient with an intrigue, for example, you're encouraged to take on abilities, to take on a lifestyle which supports those abilities, which steers you away from direct confrontations. This in turn encourages players to think in the shorter term, once again steering away from some of the downsides, some of the limitations of these more traditional conceptual simulations, these more traditional strategy games. Within the most recent downloadable content and the Royal Court, we've seen a further development of interpersonal relationships. The game and this downloadable content's expansion builds complex connections between characters based on traits. Characters with similar traits tend to like each other more, tend to become more friendly with each other. These interactions can spark a series of events which provide additional narrative, but more importantly, provide a deeper role-playing opportunity. In many respects, the game has become something more like a basic version of the system James has described within his game earlier. We also see mechanical pushes on player behavior, mechanical pushes to get players to roleplay in more depth. And this is represented in particular through a system of stress, mental breaks, and coping mechanisms. And this is where the content warning comes in. So, over the course of the game, characters will acquire stress when they undertake actions which are outside of their character, which move beyond the traits or which go against the traits which they have assigned to them. So, for example, honest characters don't like starting plots. They don't like being involved in schemes to take advantage of their opponents or indeed their friends. They in particular don't like being involved in plots to murder other characters. In a similar fashion, craven characters really don't like going to war. They don't like being forced into combat, and doing so will cause their stress levels to rise. Other factors may increase stress from events surrounding friends and family, particularly death. It being imprisoned can increase stress, and raising children can also increase your stress. The accumulation of stress can ultimately lead to mental breaks. If a character accumulates too much stress, then they suffer one of these mental breaks. And this gives various penalties and can spark a number of negative events. More extreme stress can lead to more extreme mental breaks. And when a character suffers one of these mental breaks, the player or the computer-controlled actor has two options, basically. They can choose to try and keep it together, to try and continue as things are currently, which will inevitably lead to them gaining more stress, to receiving further penalties to their ability to rule their kingdom, or they can adopt a coping mechanism in order to reduce their stress levels. They get to pick one of two options drawn semi-randomly from a list of 14. Now, these coping mechanisms, these include therapists' encourage methods within the modern world, so you may get the option to cope with stress by getting more exercise, by journaling, by literally writing things down, or by speaking to people. There are more harmful approaches or more controversial approaches, including substance abuse of hashish and alcohol, leaning into eating disorders, and more religious options, becoming contrite, becoming a flagellant, depending on the religion. Each of these systems, each of these coping mechanisms can reduce the character's stress, they can reduce the penalties faced by the character, but they usually come at a cost. Alcoholism tends to damage health, it reduces governing and combat ability as well. Likewise, being contrite reduces the ability to keep secrets and engage plots. You don't want a contrite character joining you in any sort of scheme, they will inevitably give the game away. The therapist-approved methods also give boosts to various statistics, so coping with stress through exercise will tend to make the character more healthy, will often make them more martially proficient. And these mechanisms, they have an impact on gameplay through the management of stress, most notably, but they also act as balances to many of the best traits. So many of the best traits in Crusader Kings 2, many of the traits which give the broadest array of benefits, such as diligent, just, and ambitious, which tend to give advantages across the board in terms of the various stats assigned to each character. Each of these traits give substantial but yeah, and make stress more of a problem. They aggravate stress gain, or they make it harder to get rid of stress once it has been acquired. And all of this creates a soft limit on gameplay. There are very few actions which are ever denied to players because of their character traits. However, there are consequences if the player acts out of character. All of this encourages roleplay. This is something that's demonstrable through a couple of surveys, but also was also evident on the game boards. There are a growing number of roleplay boards based around Crusader Kings 3 in a manner that we didn't see to the same extent within previous iterations. And these approaches, they also discourage power gaming and this sort of multi-generational megalomaniacal world conquest that we see in other iterations of the game, and indeed in strategy games in general. But there are limitations, and it remains the case that while world conquest is perhaps becoming a bit less likely, it still remains the default goal of many players. It's still the way that these games are perceived to be run. It seems still perceived to be the key objective of the game. Once again, perhaps because players are presented with a map, they become determined to paint it their colour. So, how can we take this further? How can we develop things in a way which takes us a bit further away from these standard world conquest, standard conceptual simulation tendencies? There's a few ideas that I have here. We can set objectives which discourage world conquest, perhaps encouraging players to act more like the characters in which they embody, whether that's building churches, keeping people happy, or just taking a break for a while. We can perhaps reduce the game's scope in some ways, maybe reduce the geographic area. Why not be a count in Ireland and never step outside of Ireland? Or why not just reduce the chronological scope, just playing as a single king? There's also a lot of potential for succession games, so playing as the ruler for one lifetime and then handing the game off to another player. Indeed, this is something that's particularly popular within Crusader Kings 3, and it's something that's been going on within strategy games ever since saving and emailing was a realistic possibility. To wrap everything up then, it's five things really. First of all, I want to underline there's a huge role-playing potential within strategy games. There's a lot that can be done here to alter and I think benefit the historical experience acquired through these games. A growing number of games have been taking steps to support roleplay. Crusader Kings 3 is a particular example of this, although there are plenty of other examples here as well. It's important to emphasize that limitations do remain, no matter regardless of the steps that these games have been taking. A large body of players will revert to world conquest. A large number of the underlying limitations of the genre still exist. And this leads me to think that, we need to do more to break genres. And indeed, a lot of these moves to support games shift away from genre conventions. Finally, just very briefly to talk about the broader implications here. We need to highlight the limits of Chapman's system. And to be fair, Chapman highlights the limitations himself. This is always meant to be a starting point, not an immutable absolute. In particular, we need to look at how role-playing fits into realist and conceptual simulations. It's clearly a different way of doing history in games, but there's no real place for it within the model. It's just lumped right in the middle, as I've highlighted here. There are certain advantages to role-playing simulations over realist or conceptual simulations. And if we're talking about breaking genres, we need to talk about bending Chapman's model. Ultimately, we need to get out of traditional approaches. We need to get into character. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you all for your 3 papers. We are running a little bit low on time, but we will use the minutes that we have left for the Q&A. So again, if you have questions for our speakers, either feel free to raise your hands or to write them down in the chat, and we will read them for you. I will begin again to get the conversation going, and I would like to begin with a question for Olga. first of all, thank you for your paper. I really, really enjoyed it. The Blasphemous, I didn't know about the game. It looks very, very interesting. I really want to take a look at it. Um, and I wanted to maybe relate two elements that I saw in your presentation. On the one hand is what you indeed mentioned, that is very smart what the game does, right? Trying to sell this experience of penance through the difficulty of the game, through making making the game painful and frustrating, and having your relief in the end because of you beating the game. But also, and this is the element that I wanted to highlight and get your opinion out of your own experience playing the game, is the aesthetic element of the game, of these very greedy Middle Ages, right? Uh, Maybe intuitively it makes sense, this idea of pain, redemption to be followed with darkness, sinfulness, macabre elements, and such and such. So what again, I'm not an expert about medieval mysticism, but then I would like to ask you, how did you see the game using this combination of mysticism, this very greedy, dark environment related to the whole topic and experience that they are trying to sell?
Well, it is a good, but well, quite a difficult question, Juan. Thank you. And to be honest, my answer would probably depend. So at least, in my opinion, the game managed pretty well to transmit this message of mystical but also stereotypical Middle Ages. But sometimes it didn't manage to deliver some stereotypical tropes about medieval mysticism, for example. So they used the ideas about late medieval mysticism quite selectively, for instance. So I can mention just one quick example, that many late medieval mystics, and especially the German ones, for instance, told about the glowing fire in their chests when they think about Christ and the sacrifice that he made for the humanity. So the game does not use this trope, for example. So I would say that they use the Middle Ages quite stereotypically, especially on the visual level. But the way how they orchestrated it on the conceptual level is nevertheless quite logical, and in my opinion is, well, congenial.
Thank you for that. Maybe Francis, if you want to ask your question, and then I can retake it after that.
Well, it's kind of a general question for the three, because it's a kind of a feeling I'm getting from all of them. And the term I would use is lost in translation, in the sense that there is always a desire to create a medieval world, a world which was known from the past, but also to make it playable. In other words, something that people who live in the 20th and 21st century would want to play. So suddenly what you have to do is you have to translate these worlds into worlds that we can understand. And attitudes change, and what expectations change, and how do we see the Middle Ages through these games has always been a problem, which is why I quoted The Rats by Camus for when you're talking about the plague, because I mean that's there are other references. There are 500 years of later references coming through that are also going to be filters of the way we see the Middle Ages and the way we see history and the way we see sickness, for instance, and things like that. How those things lived in the Middle Ages strikes me as difficult to translate in terms of a video game, for instance. Many of these games are about warrior kings invading the world. Few of them are about peasants tilling the land, or basically the blacksmiths making the swords. In the sense that it is much less about the life of the times and how those times were seen, including in religious terms, as it is how we perceive those things. In other words, the translation and what is lost in translation.
I don't know which of you would like to give it a go first. So maybe we can do it like in the order of the presentations. First Olga, then Raquel, then Rob. Sounds good? Okay.
Just to chew on.
Yeah, maybe I can start very quickly. So if I understood correctly, so the question was how like the game well, manipulate, how the games manipulate the Middle Ages and what image of the Middle Ages they transmit to the audience. So I would say that in my case, this Blasphemous video game follows the stereotypical representation of the Middle Ages, because if we even look at the screenshots that I provided, so the Middle Ages are portrayed as the dark, gloomy, sometimes even disgusting, dirty period. And of course, this representation was coined even during the Renaissance period and then was replicated many, many times and for many centuries. And as we all, I mean, the medievalists know, it wasn't true. So we're trying to oppose this stereotype. But I would say that it is also, well, a decorative trope to also transmit this gloomy emotional message.
I follow. I think the video games do not anything that literature has not done in the past or nowadays. So I mean that we must understand that there is a fictional scenario in the video game. So the material, different material, in this case, the historical ones, must be or can be manipulated, but in a good sense, I think, in order to create a new work. So the reference, as Francis point out at Camus, for example, put in the play, in the game, another level of interpretation. The interpretations led in the hands of the players, as in literature, as in cinema. It depends of our knowledge, our training. So I think it is not necessary to be accurate to the historical facts to create that world, no? That new world that the game offers.
Rob, I don't know, you would like to add something?
Sorry, I was very taken by what Raquel was saying there and typing furiously. So there's a few things going on here, I think. So Francis is absolutely right. I think we're never going to get completely away from medievalist stereotypes, tropes within games. And as Raquel says, it's not going to be, it's not possible to really get away from that in any other media. Games aren't particularly special in that regard. What I would say though, games, while there's a huge amount of similarity with this other media, it's not just medievalist tropes that we're looking for here. We've got a whole bunch of gaming tropes coming in. I think with Olga's paper, I was going to say as well, so there's this, it's leaning hugely on medievalist religious undertones, and I'm absolutely fascinated by this, but particularly as this game, Blasphemous, it goes beyond Dark Souls in many respects. So Dark Souls goes hardcore because the Middle Ages are violent and computer games are violent, so let's make a really violent, really hard game. Blasphemous takes it, I think, the next logical step and brings in these religious elements. I was absolutely fascinated by the paper. And that's the thing, we have this collision between medievalists and gaming tropes. And that gives us an option to do things a bit differently, I think. And I think with more or less all of the games we've talked about, these games, they tend to fall into a lot of these genre ruts. So whether it's hardcore, hack and slash, whether it's, well, I suppose Assassin's Creed has made its own genre there, or whether it's strategy games, there are these expectations which are in part coming from medievalist tropes, in part coming from gaming tropes. However, there's a huge demand for games which step outside this. the games which do something a bit differently. So like Blasphemous does, and like what James, what Mohammed, what Asa were talking about with their games in the previous session. There is this huge demand for moving past this. It's just the larger studios aren't typically willing to jump on board because there's a risk of buying into it. I think possibly the most interesting, the best way of doing this is just by messing with genre expectations, by bringing in mechanics which are either entirely new, which have just been stripped out of different games and being used in a very interesting, very different way. So I think there's a lot of potential here, but yeah, we're always going to be tied to medievalist tropes.
Same problems in films and novels as well, actually. This each has their universe to deal with, yes.
Thank you, Francis. Maybe I want to retake something from precisely from that question, because I believe again that what Francis is saying has a lot of weight behind it. It's in the end this very strange exercise of trying to recreate a medieval world that is very different from ours through a medium that is very much modern, not only in the sense of the technology that we use to create it, but everything that goes behind the production of these games, right? And from that perspective, I would like to ask Rob a little bit of what you were mentioning with the development of this role-playing element within Crusader Kings 3. As you mentioned, Crusader Kings 3 is Crusader Kings in general is a very good middle point between these differentiations somehow that Chapman, well, more to the conceptual part. But again, it's a strategy game that puts you in the shoes of a specific individual and living the life of this individual, right? I know that you have been working with Paradox Studios, and I would like to ask if maybe you can illustrate a little bit behind the process of creating, for example, these scenarios that you showed, right? So the stress system, the breakdown, the coping. Of course, and this is the issue with the history in the end, right? We are both very similar, but also very different to the people from the past. So these experiences feel very relatable to us. But then how to develop them within this context of the Middle Ages to convey something specific about the medieval world. The use maybe of sources of some practices, like for example, flagellants and such. So maybe you could expand a little bit behind the process, if you know, of course, about the development of this new type of mechanics.
This is, well, in one way, this is convenient because I had nothing to do with the organization, the creation of those systems. So my knowledge is pretty much limited to what's being released to everybody. But on the bright side, that does mean I'm able to talk about it without violating any NDAs and so forth. So my understanding of it, and bearing in mind this is not remotely professional insider knowledge or anything. My understanding of it, this is part of the broad intention of the game, the developers to really emphasize that this is a dynasty simulator rather than a ruler simulator. And obviously this is something that's been there right the way back since the original Crusader Kings with its chunky graphics and everything. And yeah, in many ways, one of the underlying principles throughout the game, I think, has been to try and get the player into the medieval mindset, or at least to meet the medieval mindset halfway. So a number of these events, well, there are Easter eggs scattered throughout everything. I think there are still references to Monty Python, to all manner of Arthurian films and so forth scattered throughout the game. I think most of the My Little Pony stuff was excised since Crusader Kings 2, but nevertheless, there are these, there's leaning on a lot of modern ideas, a lot of modern representations, a lot of modern memes to get the player closer, in some respects, closer to a medievalist approach or medieval approach. And I think this is a really interesting thing you've hit on. I really hope someone who's got more background in this area than me will get into, is how these representations, how these representations which aren't medieval, which aren't necessarily even medievalist, can nevertheless be useful in encouraging roleplay along medieval lines. It's like all these in-jokes you get around the table playing Dungeons and Dragons or your role-playing game of choice. It's a way of interacting, which in some respects is closer to the Middle Ages than might be expected. So I've not answered your question remotely there, but I'm hoping someone else will be able to.
Well, I mean, we have something of a lively conversation in the chat. So maybe I don't know if the people who would like to add something to the conversation here. No, well then
We're going into all sorts of crazy things. This might be more of a tower discussion, actually, that was going on. But no. But the point being was the term of the medieval is also complex, because in some of the slice of life games, you have a problem of actually defining what is the slice of life in medieval terms. And I was noticing, like, it just jogged my mind, I think Fernand Braudel pushed the notion of medieval all the way to the 1750s in some ways and in some points of view. So what is and what is not medieval is also an interesting problem, actually, which could be addressed, because in many ways, because I think that the term medieval only works in, I think, in a very specific time and geographic frame, in fact. And if once you break that frame, you have problems. And I think that's part of what's going on in the discussions here, actually, is what is medieval and what is just peasant life. And peasant life is much more eternal than the medieval world. What were medieval politics and what were the politics at the time, which are beyond medieval, which is also a term that was invented at a specific time with a specific meaning. So that I find interesting. It's like when people talk about the medieval world, I'm always very not upset, but disturbed about it, because it just doesn't mean anything when you're discussing the medieval in a place like India or sub-Saharan Africa. It just there aren't the historical references that give the word any meaning, except unless we consider the world from a trope of Western Europe, which is not true.
Okay, I think we have a final question from Acer, so let's do it very quickly because we're running out of time.
Oh, I don't know about very quickly. I was having a hard time thinking of how to frame this, because it's not quite a question. It's sort of more a way of thinking about developments and game development. One of the things that I wanted to do with my paper, and I thank you also, Robert, for the shout outs, but I wanted to talk with developers and ask them about the process of development. So for example, we're talking a lot about Crusader Kings, which is the dynastic simulator, but there is a process of development. Paradox is notorious for releasing lots of DLCs which continuously add elements to the game. And from a historical perspective, this is quite interesting. In EU4, for example, they progressively released DLCs which drew very directly from historical research, talking about different areas of the world and different political dynamics. But one of the things that strikes me about Crusader Kings 3, the most recent one, is in contrast to the previous game, you could, as a player, form a religion, you can design a religion and optimize it, essentially, around your own personal grand strategy. And what makes me think about this, or when I think about this, I think that there's a process of back and forth between a desire to make a game fun in a competitive sense, and a desire to make it historical, which sort of for me, it invokes the idea of suffering, suffering to understand what life would be like, or something like that. And I'm wondering if you guys have thoughts about this. Unfortunately, I reached out to these different studios. Warhorse was the only one who was polite to give a response, and they said they were too busy. So we can't know for certain, but I would like to know, I'm thinking of, from a development perspective, how it changes over time, how these games change over time.
So is anybody who would like to tackle this question just to close the panel?
I can very quickly then, if someone else wants to grab this. Basically, so Paradox is modular. It's iterative in its release of new material. In some ways, that's in some ways that's a benefit because it means the game's basically a discussion between the various developers, typically with a lot of player feedback, trying to balance things, trying to make the game more interesting, very often trying to teeter it to something that's more historical in some respects. But as Asa, you just said, very often teetering it to something that's more enjoyable, more playable for the player, whether that's creating a religion, whether that's min-maxing the hell out of a variation of Christianity. The development systems vary vastly by studio. I think your best bet to get more information is to go to the smaller developers. Trying to think of off the top of my head, Polymorph Games with Foundation have been very good at talking to people about their processes. Sliverine with Fields of Glory have also been fairly open. I think the bigger the studio, the more successful the game. Well, I don't think they're necessarily less friendly, but they're perhaps getting a greater volume of people coming in asking them for information, for insight. They're perhaps less able to respond to everybody, perhaps less willing to do so because they don't need to sell their games in the same way. So yeah, I particularly like the idea that there's this corporate authorship. So there's all these various ideas coming in from the various different members of the development team, contributing to the creation of the game, contributing to the story, the history that it tells, very often with the input of players, whether it's as beta testers, whether that's feeding back into downloadable content. So in some ways, it's fundamentally different from any other form of media, which I'm possibly going to get shot down for because I know there's a number of film scholars in the audience, but yeah.
Okay, thank you, Rob. So with that, we close our panel. Again, thank you to all our panelists and to our audience. The next panel will take place at 2 p.m., again, through the same link. And the title of our next panel is Reconstructing the Middle Ages in Popular Media. So we hope to see you then, and we'll see you soon. Thank you again.